I'll try to paint a general picture at the level of, what you do and what I do being very much the same thing, and then hopefully put out enough ideas that there's a good basis for talking together and going further. So first off, it was about 15 years ago that we established a sustainability consortium. The Society for Organizational Learning, which is a global network of people in a lot of different places around the world working on all kinds of different issues, but the common denominator being how do you build organizations, and really more and more networks of organizations that can continually learn and evolve. That's why it's called the Society for Organizational Learning. Not surprisingly, there's a big chunk, I would say today probably 80 or 90%, who have the exact same deep core concerns that I'm sure motivate many, if not all of you, which is that we know we have to change how we live in this world, that the social as well as biological or ecological impacts of how we live today are really not going to continue. I don't even like the word sustainability too much, because I think it's kind of obvious that we can't continue doing what we're doing. We don't need to say that. But what we do really need to do is create pictures and ideas of an alternative that's really more attractive. I actually don't believe, and I think 40 years of experience, maybe you could say even more, of the environmental movement kind of illustrates the fact that you can only get so much change by telling people how bad things are. And be less bad. Don't do this. Don't grow. Don't pollute. Don't da-da-da-da-da. It turns out to be one of the most common, I would say, strategic flaws of change leaders in a lot of settings. Because oftentimes our efforts in change are motivated by real problems. And we want those problems to go away. But whether or not they're basically social justice issues or environmental issues, it just turns out to be a really crappy change strategy to keep kind of telling people, be less bad. Don't do it. And it kind of contradicts what has always been the first principle of our work. And that principle is really to mobilize creativity and imagination, commitment, perseverance, things that we all know we need. There really needs to be an aspirational energy. The power of aspiration is much greater than the power of desperation. If you're in a state of fear, or I'm in a state of fear, there's something that makes us really fearful, we can do a lot for a short period of time. It's totally inadequate for a longer journey. People did not build cathedrals because they were so fearful of not having a cathedral. Right? They built cathedrals because they could see a picture of something, even if it might be many generations, that they felt really proud to contribute to. There was an aesthetic. There was something beautiful. Even if you were only doing some small part of something larger, you could live with that, as long as what you were doing was something you could really be proud of. So there's a kind of a fundamental of what I would just call the collective creative process, which is really quite different than just reacting to problems. Problem solving is great, but when problem solving is the dominant energy, the dominant orientation, we simply do not mobilize those kind of qualities I just rattled off to you. The imagination, the perseverance, the trust, all those things. We just don't mobilize them to the degree needed. We only can mobilize that through something that's closer to a collective creative process. It's not a black or white thing, because all of you, we all have been involved in creative processes. What I mean by a creative process is really simple. Creating. Really working to bring something into existence that you want to see exist. That's what the word to create means, to bring into reality. We've all been part of that. And we know that it activates certain qualities of energy that simply aren't activated any other way. bringing something into reality that you care deeply about is one of the most important things that human beings ever do. In the process, if you're engaged in that, I mean, a perfect example of this to me would be being a parent. You ask people in all different cultures, what are some of the most meaningful aspects of your life? One that will always show up, often the most common one, is being a parent. Well, being a parent is participating in the creating process. You're literally helping a human being come into existence. Obviously, the biological part of it is pretty short-lived. That's the beginning. Then you have the rest of your life to help a person continue to grow and develop as a human being. It has deep meaning to all of us. Of course, along the way, there are a lot of problems. So as I was saying, it's not a black or white matter. Problem solving, if it's part of the creative process, or the creating process, is very important. Of course, that's why problem-solving skills and our ability to solve problems really matter. The point here is more subtle. It's really a point about the energy. If the energy is primarily one of solving problems, you simply get a totally different type of process than if the energy is primarily one of bringing into existence something you care about. And if you take that as a kind of a first principle, you just look at anything you're doing, anything, doesn't matter what it is, and ask the simple question, what are we trying to bring into reality? What are we trying to create here? What will look different as a result of our efforts? What's the nature of the accomplishment that we really care about? I'm using different words, obviously, to describe the same phenomenon. But that's what we mean by the collective creative process. Human beings engaged in creating, bringing into reality something they care about, will learn in very different ways than if they're just trying to solve problems. And it's not magical or mystical. At one point in your life, in one point in all of our lives, we wanted to walk. We didn't walk. We wanted to walk. And at some point, that aspiration built up in us, and we ventured out on something that's very treacherous. We started walking. And of course, we mostly fell down, because that's what always happens when you're trying to create something. It never turns out the way you want initially. So then you pick yourself up. But that energy to want to walk, to want to ride a bicycle, to want to speak. The mastery of natural language is one of the most complex learning processes in a human being's lifetime. It totally transforms our sense of who we are, our sense of how we relate, our connection to our social reality, and it's driven by the same process. There's some point in your life say, I want to be able to. So that's always been the first kind of cornerstone of all this work on learning. Human beings learn best when there's something that draws their aspiration. As I say, you can take anything you're working on, including all the stuff that you guys are doing, and just simply keep asking yourself the question, what do we want to create? You can also ask the same question retrospectively. It can be very powerful. One of the simplest practices that we often get people to introduce into an organization is get a group of people to sit around and reflect a little bit on what they have accomplished that they're proud of. We're all busy. We're all probably mostly kind of very forward-looking, personality-wise, like, here's the next challenge, we've done this, now let's move on. None of us want to spend a lot of time patting ourselves in the back, and kind of self-congratulation doesn't seem like the particularly important value to most of us, which is, I think, perfectly fine. But when we don't reflect on what we have accomplished, two things happen. One, we fail to acknowledge and build momentum. But there's a second question we always weave into that. And who was essential for the accomplishing? So the little practice is very simple. You get a group of people together, identify something people are proud of they've accomplished. And then you just also ask the question, and who was necessary in order to accomplish it? And through a simple practice like that, you'll begin to reveal the second cornerstone of this work, which is our networks of relationships are what enable organizations to work. And they are, at their best, what enable us to be collectively creative. It's a very relational world we live in. And if you start talking like that, it'll often turn a lot of people off. It sounds romantic, it sounds idealistic. But if you anchor it in what we need to get done, by anchoring it in what we have gotten done, very quickly people will discover, in fact, the way we typically do this practice, we'll say get out a piece of paper and start writing down the names of people without whom you would not have accomplished what you just identified as an accomplishment you were proud of. Write the names down. And after 5-10 minutes, people have got a list of 10 names, 15 names. A lot of times they say, well, I need an hour to do this. But you just stop it after 5 or 10 minutes. And then you kind of have this list, because it's making real this simple idea that it is our networks of collaboration, our helping of one another, that actually is how we accomplish what we accomplish. One person never really accomplishes much, really, if you look closely. There's always networks of collaboration. Then said the last part of the practice, which is often the most emotionally kind of meaningful to people, they look at their little list, they've got a list of 10 names or 12 names or whatever, and you say, okay, go to the bottom of the list and just make up a number now. Count up 3. Cross that person's name off the list. I can't do that. We could have never done it without Fred. We couldn't. Immediately, they'll start to realize the emotional underpinnings of this. Because again, we tend to be very focused on the doing, what we're trying to accomplish. That's very appropriate. We're all very kind of oriented towards what we want to accomplish. But it's the qualities of those relationships that are so vital. We discovered this practice, must have been almost 15 years ago. There was a group of people at Hewlett-Packard who had worked with a wild and crazy, brilliant biologist from Chile. His name is Humberto Maturana. He's really become a teacher to a lot of us. And he's a very unusual guy. He's a little bit like an Einstein-like figure in biology. He's very famous in biology. He has made pioneering discoveries about the nature of cognition or awareness from a biological perspective. But what really makes Humberto so interesting is he's thought very deeply about the social implications. What are the implications of understanding the nature of our awareness for how we live and work together? So they had developed this practice from Humberto. What do we accomplish? Who is essential for accomplishing it? And then reflecting on what it meant to have those relationships by that simple little practice. So imagine, some name not there. They discovered over the next year or two, as they started to continue this practice, it became what they called continual identifying their networks of, they called them their knowledge networks. This was Hewlett-Packard. This was the biggest division of Hewlett-Packard. Actually, the people who design and produce all the cartridges, the ink supply cartridges for all those printers. It's the most profitable part of the whole company. Has been for a long time, and really, really well managed. And they had developed this practice. They called it reflecting on our knowledge networks. And what they discovered over time, as a result of embedding this practice of reflecting on who needed to help who to accomplish what, the networks got stronger. It started to become part of the way they thought. Again, like all of us, very task-oriented people, very focused on their practical challenges, very creative, really very visionary group, very sophisticated technology. They love, as engineers do, the advancing of the technology. But they were gradually developing, you might say, a kind of a social or emotional intelligence to go with their technical engineering intelligence. And what they noticed over several years from becoming familiar and practicing regularly, reflecting on who needed to help who to do what, that those networks got stronger. Their knowledge networks got stronger. Literally, it would get to the point where a manager would have this great idea to reorganize. And those of you who have been in bigger organizations, you know managers have these great ideas all the time. We're going to reorganize and move these people over here, or we're going to downsize because we've got a financial stress. And literally when they would do this, the engineers would show up on their desk, put on their table their knowledge networks, and say, okay, for this technical problem or that technical problem, this is the group of people who need to help each other. So you want to reorganize people, how are you going to conserve these knowledge networks? It was fascinating. And it taught us all a very important lesson that, one, work is all about collaboration. We often don't see it because we all see the hierarchy. We know who's boss. We know the boss we report to. And we tend to think that our first picture of an organization is usually a hierarchy. Right? Who reports to who? Because the collaborative networks are invisible, we tend not to see them. Well, these people started to see them. But it also taught us something very important. I'm hoping and assuming something that will resonate for a lot of you. The huge impact from subtle shifts in awareness. Once people started to pay attention to their networks of collaboration, the networks got stronger. They could talk to you for hours. These are engineers. These are technically oriented people. Probably about, I'm guessing, probably about 25 to 30% female. So they were a little higher percentage female than you would find in a lot of highly technical organizations, but they were predominantly men. But here they were, all deeply immersed in their understanding of their knowledge networks. Now that was the term they used for their bosses, because they were always trying to illustrate how practical this was. But actually what developed internally within the company, and this was about 10,000 person division, the largest and most profitable division of Hewlett Packard over time, was a little different terminology. They called them their networks of loving relations. No kidding. Engineers all talked about their loving relations. Now, they were engineers. They had a very precise definition of their loving relations. And I think it's a beautiful definition, actually. And they got this from Umberto, the biologist I mentioned. Umberto defines love as the act of allowing another to be a legitimate other. It's a beautiful definition. Love as the act of allowing another to be a legitimate other. So if you go back to Greek, this is not eros, right? This is what the Greeks would have called agape. This kind of relational world in which we meet each other and live and operate in a world of, you could call it profound respect, you could call it compassion, you could call it empathy, but they called it love. So here was a group of engineers who generated tremendous profit and innovation, who lived in a reality of they called their loving awareness. Now that didn't happen right away, but that was a terminology that eventually developed because they thought it was accurate. Yeah, collaboration was the outcome. Accomplishment was what, of course, at one level they also cared about a lot, but they started to realize that the quality of those relationships were what they equally cared about. And as they became more attentive to the quality of the relationships, how they talked with each other, what happened in a meeting. We all know meetings can be very difficult. There are breakdowns. You know, someone comes in and they're in distress. Something hasn't worked out. There's a problem. There's a crisis. There's a natural tendency to point fingers. This happens. This is life. They started to pay a lot of attention to how they would respond when these breakdowns occurred. Do we really listen to each other? I've long felt it's the single most underestimated power of leadership. Real leadership always starts with listening. Do we really listen to each other? When someone says something that I really think is wrong, I think they're crazy. I think they're really out of touch with reality. I just stop listening. A lot of times we stop listening as soon as we see the person, right? Oh, one of those. Because we think in categorical terms. Oh, You know, I'm an engineer. Oh God, here come the salespeople. They're all going to give us a pitch on how we got to cut our development times, whatever. We all have stereotypes. We all have categories in our heads, and we quickly stop listening. They start to pay attention to when their awareness would become hijacked by an emotion of judgment. It was fascinating to watch. And as they did that, their strength of those relationships got greater. So it's a very beautiful example of where the real leverage lies. It's taken a long, long time, I think, for all of us doing this work to appreciate this. But I would say all the leverage always lies in subtle shifts of awareness. And there's 3 of these that we pay a lot of attention to now in the work. How we open our minds so that we really can deal with things that we're usually closed to. Someone says something that's totally different opinion than my opinion. Oh yeah, they're a Republican. Whatever closes our minds. How we open our minds. How we continually remain vigilant in those instants when the mind closes. How we open our hearts, as was illustrated by the engineers who started to realize that what this relational world was really all about was profound respect. How we really appreciate the reality of other, not just what they say, but what's behind what they say. You could call it deep empathy, obviously you could call it compassion. And the third type of openness is really the most subtle in a way. And we often now call it just the opening of will. And I need to talk about that and explain a little bit what I mean by that. And it was actually Otto Scharmer who first kind of came up with those 3 terms. If you've encountered his work on presence or theory U, he has a brand new book that just came out, which is outstanding, called Leading from the Emerging Future. He says, in all his work for 20 plus years in different organizations, with this whole idea that real systemic change is a process of shifting awareness. Opening minds, opening hearts, and opening wills. Now, what does that open will mean? It basically is allowing ourselves to let our intention, because we always have intention. You know, the Buddhists call intention one of the 5 omnipresent states. There's always intention. Any setting, there's intention. How we allow that to also be influenced. I used a phrase a minute ago with Otto's work on sensing emerging futures, because in the title of the book, it calls it Leading from the Emerging Future. That sensing part has a lot to do with open mind and open heart. But then the actualizing part, how we go from an awareness of what's happening to an intention. At that point, usually the intentions are predetermined by our past. We have an agenda, right? We all have agendas. We come to the setting of the agenda. We know what we need to accomplish. That's fine. It's perfectly natural. But can we be in that difficult meeting and allow something to emerge that shifts our intention? Something to emerge in our awareness. We go, no. There's something a little different that really could happen. In that moment, usually it's a much bigger intention that comes into play. And we start to realize that there's something that could happen that's even more than we had imagined. Certainly different than we had imagined. That's what we mean when we talk about open will. Open mind, open heart, open will. 3 fundamental aspects of awareness that really are critical to systemic change. Let me make a couple of last comments to define the term. I'm ending with this rather than starting with this. Jonathan said, share how to build a learning organization, how to go about systemic change. The word system is a crappy word. We've all been kind of stuck with it for a long time because there's a lot of heritage and different traditions in science, and it's become a term that has been around a lot in the organization development, organization field. But most people hear the word system and they think computer system, right? Or it's not my fault, it's the stupid system, right? Rules, regulations, the system. But they don't think about what we mean by real systemic change. So sometimes it's best just to set the word aside entirely. And what I'm talking about when I talk about systemic change is how a family becomes healthy. How a group of people working together start to develop collective intelligence. Even how a larger organization starts to develop a collective intelligence, an ability to see, to sense, and to actualize things people care about. So a human system is not a machine. A human system, a social system, is a network of interdependency that we create through our living. Nobody tells the members of a family how to organize the family. The family organizes itself. And before we know it, this person over here, they're kind of running the cooking, and this person over here is organizing the this. And so these roles emerge naturally. I'm not saying they're good or bad, but that's how it happens. But it's more than just the roles. It's the assumptions. Because a human system works the way it works because of how we think. And how we act that gets embedded in the habitual ways of doing things. Habits of thought, habits of action, which eventually take the form, we often call it artifacts. What we mean by that is you take a business, what you measure. Be a perfect example. Every business has to measure certain things. You have metrics for performance. Perfectly appropriate part of any system of management. Why do we measure what we measure, though? This is what seems like we should measure. Well, how do we know that? Well, it's because of a set of assumptions, usually very habitual assumptions. We measure profit because we've always measured profit. We measure whatever we measure because we've always done it. So if you look at the why the system is functioning the way it's functioning, you see habits of thought, habits of action, which then eventually become embedded in tangible aspects of the system, like the organization chart, the metrics, the reward systems, how we measure cost, whatever. Now, all of this comes together when we just come to a very practical question. How do we need to be shifting our awareness? How do we need to be able to be living in order to build enterprises that can continually keep advancing that awareness? One of the fundamental conundrums, I'll just put it this way, of all cultivation practice is the cultivators, the people who are meditating, the people who are trying to elevate or call it, shift their awareness, are very focused on shifting their awareness. Everybody who meditates wants to have silence, right? Or they want to have some transcendent experience. They want to experience nothingness. Whatever. We've got all these concepts. Ken Wilber and I were talking about this one day, and he had a great story. He was telling about a retreat he did years ago with a teacher he had. We were sharing stories about our respective teachers. And he was a Tibetan Dzogchen teacher. And Ken said, so I'm in the 5th day of this retreat, and I'm having some profound experiences. And I'm going to my teacher. And I'd had very similar experiences for years. And I'm telling my teacher, I saw the light, and I saw this. And the teacher going, yeah. And then the teacher he asked me one question. He said, and what were you experiencing before all that? So one of the deep conundrums when you deal in this area of awareness is we tend to focus on a state we want to get to. And we totally miss the subtle field, the awareness before the phenomenon. The moment or the instant when there's a little opening, and then after that something interesting happens. So this business of awareness-based systemic change is very subtle. Because yes, we really are interested in opening minds, opening hearts, opening will. But the more you progress in that direction, the subtler it gets. And the less black and white, the less it's based on a simple experience. Now, that might sound a little esoteric. I apologize if that does. But here's how it relates to what you guys are all here for. You're all here, as I understand it, in a process of inquiry and learning together about how we get better at the behavioral aspects of sustainability, the behavioral aspects of energy efficiency. Let's be very kind of mundane and focused for a minute. I don't need to tell you this because this is probably one of the things you all know. The potential energy footprint of a well-designed building is often very different than the actual energy footprint, because it always comes down to how we behave. Okay? So we can look at this as how we get people to move from state A to state B. They're not turning off the lights, we want them to turn off the lights. Okay, that's fine. That's one of the things we want. I'm in a building here. This is actually the most energy efficient building on the MIT campus. It's the new Sloan School of Management. And it's really cool. I have several friends who worked for years in the design and specification and working with the architects and the builders. And it is, it's a really cool building. And it's also a really nice space. People like being in the space. It's beautifully designed from a social standpoint. And, of course, what they've been doing for the last 2.5 years since it opened is tracking it. How much energy do we really use? And then how can we all be aware of that? Key word, aware of that. So there's a very important difference between trying to get people to change their behavior and creating an environment where awareness is continually becoming, let's just say, more complete, more present, and guess what? Behaviors will start to change. The high leverage approach to shifting behaviors is to work on shifting awarenesses. We all know that. You see somebody, maybe me, myself, acting in a rather insensitive way around certain other people. You say, well, you shouldn't do that, You hurt that person's feelings. Well, that's fine. That's kind of giving me a behavioral rule. Don't say the sort of thing you said because you hurt the person's feelings. But of course, the real higher leverage shift is becoming more aware of the person's feelings. If I'm more aware of that, then I actually will naturally behave in different ways. Some people are like that kind of naturally. Actually, in a funny way, those people who are super aware of other people's feelings, they sometimes have to learn how to modify that awareness. Because they're so concerned about hurting the person's feelings, they actually won't even do something that could be useful. But it's all about how we learn to develop more and more control of the awareness, because then our behaviors will naturally follow. So if you're in the business of paying attention to behaviors, guess what? You're in the business of working on awareness, because that's where all the leverage will ultimately lie. So hopefully that makes it a little less esoteric, and hopefully it gives a good background so we can start to talk about what that might mean particularly. As I said, I starting off here with these general comments because it's a good way for me to introduce a little bit of what we do, but only so I can put out enough ideas that we can talk together, because what really matters, of course, is how this can be helpful to you and how it can be related to your own context. A learning organization is nothing but a group of people working together, continually working to refine their awareness around what they want to create, how they are with one another, and how do we see the larger system we're part of. End of story. Okay? Hopefully beginning of conversation.
I just want to make it clear to everybody that the conversation we're going to have now can be about anything. So it does not have to be about behavior in buildings or the environment, or it's whatever came from this discussion that you want to carry forward. That's where we're going. Yeah. So, Michael, you did that.
Hi, Peter. I'm Gina Saganek, and I really appreciate your talk today. I was very excited to hear you. My question is about, I'm looking for some tips and ideas about how, I've been in an organization for about 16 years, as some of the other leaders of the organization have been there even for longer. I was there when there was 10 people, and now we, over the course of the last 16 years, have 145 people. How do we as leaders who were once the doers and the jack of all trades, how do we really separate ourselves from kind of doing all that stuff and taking on this new and different role? I'd love some insights on how we shift that and too much.
Do you mind if I just ask you one kind of question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So you said new and different role. Could you just say a few more words about how you would characterize the new and different role?
Yeah. Well, my coach says I have to stop weed whacking and get up into the self. So often I find myself on the front line solving those questions and less up in the balcony really observing and thinking and strategizing. So that's the new role I need to jump into and not have people have the habit of, oh, Gina will figure that out, give it to Gina.
Right.
And I go, sure.
So why do you do that?
I think it's just habit. I think it's just a really bad habit that I have to break. I don't know why, because I actually enjoy the balcony much better and find myself being creative, and when I get in that space doing different things. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but I have to fix that.
Well, fix is an interesting word that you should choose. Because, we fix machines. When a machine breaks, you fix it, right? You don't fix human beings. You don't fix living systems. But living systems can get stuck, and they can also evolve. But it's just, oftentimes, one of the ways we keep ourselves stuck is we think about ourselves more like a machine. I've got this problem, I've got to fix it, right? And by the way, this is a general point. You can look at the language used by people in organizations all the time, and it's just full, often, of mechanical metaphors. We have a change program, we're going to roll it out through the organization. We need leaders who can drive change. I always look at people and go, wow, do you really? Do you want somebody driving change in your family? Oh no, of course not. But we need leaders who drive change in this organization. So it's a kind of a pervasive problem, and I think it's a cultural habit, collective habit of tending to see the world in very mechanistic ways. And it tends to be very strongly reinforced in a lot of business practices. But it comes home to roost in something like you're describing. I think, first off, thank you very much for kind of putting something like this out. I think it's so real, and I think every one of us can identify with our own version of it. And I don't know how you break a bad habit. It seems like what happens more is we kind of build new habits out of choice, and the old habits just become a little less important. If they are old habits, the one thing we can expect is they're not going to leave right away. They're going to kind of stick around. You're going to have that tendency. There's going to be certain things that trigger you, but of course that's one of the things to watch for. What is it particularly that triggers me to want to get out there and whack those weeds? For many, it's often an emotional trigger. Now, I obviously have no way of knowing, but I would just look at incidents when you feel you really got triggered, and just ask myself, well, what sort of emotions were part of that trigger? typically fear. If it doesn't get fixed right away, we're in real trouble, for example. It could also be a little selfishness. I don't know. I'm just brainstorming with you. I'm just thinking out loud. What I mean by selfishness is I want to fix it. So then if that were the emotion, then you'd kind of look and say, well, how do I feel? How would I feel if somebody else fixed it? What sort of pride would I have? So the strategy here is usually pretty simple. You try to identify the things that trigger the habit you're trying to grow out of, and you try to look at what might be some alternative habits and what would draw you towards them. So today I got to lead a program. We're doing a 3-week program, I said, well, actually a 6-month program with a group of Chinese. I do a lot of work in China. This is actually the largest organization in China, which happens to be the largest organization in the world. It was a kind of interesting challenge. And the stakes are pretty high. In a situation like that, I know I have a tendency to try to jump in. Because I care about the people, and I really want this thing to work, and da-da-da-da-da. So I got all my story. I have a young man working with me who I've known for 5 years, got his doctorate here, Chinese. And I watched him lead the session this afternoon. I did a little bit to set it up, and then just said, Joe, you can do more of this. He said, okay, I'm ready. And we talked it through, and it worked wonderfully. And I know for me, one of the highest leverage things I can do for me in kind of outgrowing this habit is just orient myself towards the emotion of the pride I feel in how well he did.
That is a really good tip.
That's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Joe Cohen, and I'm an architect and a project manager in a facilities department in a university. And my question is, if you're in an organization that's very hierarchical and uses the bottom line and the mechanistic language you speak of, and that's pretty much how the organization runs, what can you do to affect change in your own organization?
So could you say a word more about the nature of the change you're interested in bringing about?
Well, that's a good question. I think a more cooperative atmosphere, an tolerant of mistakes and learning experiences rather than just to focus on the bottom line and everything coming out perfectly.
Yeah, okay. So it's really kind of a shift in culture that you're talking about. Yeah, okay. That's hard. It takes time. So, I mean, culture for an organization is, I think, in many ways analogous to personality for a person. And so, in a sense, your question is very directly related to the question we were just talking about. It's kind of like the collective habits as opposed to just individual habit. So, usually in situations like that, always try to counsel people, don't try to change the culture. I mean, because your energy to try to change it will tend to make it stronger. Find two things you can focus on. One is, find places where people are already operating more in the way you think you would like to see them operate. So we tend to talk about organization culture often in a more monolithic way than is actually true. Culture is actually pretty diverse. And there's kind of a mainstream, and there's certain people, maybe in certain types of roles, who operate in certain ways, in more predictable ways. But there's always outliers. So if you have in mind certain qualities of the cooperation and valuing people, or however you would express it, and you see that present, I would always pay attention to where it's present. Secondly, how is it useful? If you think about it in this sense, organizations are always pragmatic. They're cultural, but they're also pragmatic. People are trying to solve certain sorts of problems all the time. They're trying to accomplish certain sort of things. If you can connect places where people are operating in a little different cultural way with an ability to solve problems that's really bugging people, then you have something that often you can grow. And you'll see I'm using very similar language I was trying to use with the last question. Rather than change, which again often is kind of mechanical, how do we grow something new in the presence of something that already exists? It's a much more organic way to think about it. And for, if you're looking at organizations as opposed to individual, it usually helps to have an idea of the practical issues that would naturally draw people's attention. So if you have a group of people working together differently and they're able to accomplish something, as a result of that, maybe others would also find that very interesting. So I'm just going to make up kind of some specifics so I can be a little more specific. But just imagine you have a problem with, employee motivation or something. I don't know, just making up the particulars. But that's a real issue for people. That's not just your problem. A lot of the people in the organization are concerned about that. Okay? And you have a group over here who are operating in a little different way, and people are much more highly motivated. Can you find someone from over here to come and take a look at how they're doing it? Are they interested in seeing if there's a little different way that they could start to practice something a little bit different to allow them to deal with the practical problem? So culture is habit. Habits usually develop in organizations as a result of how people solve certain problems. Then they get stuck. And the habit turns out not to be very effective for other problems, and maybe it's not even very effective anymore for the original class of problems it was effective for. But the change process is usually very much oriented around something that proves to be useful for accomplishing something that people care about. Let me just try to give you an example. A problem that's very common in a lot of mission-driven organizations. So you guys are very mission-driven, okay? You have a strong sense of purpose. I've been around a lot of organizations that have a strong sense of purpose. Oftentimes, paradoxically, they're very difficult for the people who work there. Oftentimes there's actually behaviors that are pretty cruel, insensitive. We're so focused on our purpose. Oftentimes people are kind of getting burned out right and left. And it's all being, in a sense, justified by the lofty purpose. So that could be a tough problem, because oftentimes with a lofty purpose, people feel urgency, nobility, you've got to do something about it. And that energy takes their attention away from how do we take care of one another? How do we create an environment that's really healthy for people? So that would be a really good example of a cultural feature that's kind of embedded in the organization, but it's really problematic. I'm trying to stay away from universities as an example because you mentioned that, but I feel my own biases are pretty strong because I've been around universities most of my life, and I find oftentimes they're pretty bad in a lot of basic management practices, particularly where it requires developing collaboration and people working together. You use the term hierarchy, I'm just guessing. A lot of times the hierarchy around universities is very cultural, it's status. At a university like this, there's such a clear status hierarchy that it's really a problem. People who are doing really critical work often feel very undervalued because they're not tenured faculty, or they're not at the highest status positions. So that's a big problem. And until you make it clear to people that it's keeping them from dealing with important issues, it's usually not going to change. So that's always the nature of the process. Get it connected to pragmatic issues. Whatever something is, people are trying to get something done and they can't do it. Then help them see that there's a little different way to operate that will actually make them more effective. And you can't convince them of that. You've got to kind of create a learning process where they can operate a little differently, have a little different kind of meeting. I don't know, again, just making up specifics here. And as a result of that, they can accomplish something they care about, and then they can go, oh, maybe the way we are behaving is a problem. But it's a tricky area. But if you just keep that in mind, oftentimes you do have alternative behaviors right under your nose. And secondly, the most effective way to bring about cultural change is to help people see that they can actually be more effective in accomplishing certain things they want by behaving in a little different way.
Hi, I'm Vivian, and I work with Skanska Commercial Development on new office and multifamily buildings that we develop. And I had a question. I was interested when you were talking about the HP case about removing bias. And I can sort of understand how through kind of your own mindfulness practices you could remove bias about groups of people, right? Stereotyping.
Right.
But what about when it's individuals and sort of people you already know and have some experience with, and you're like, oh, they're just going to react that way again to whatever I'm proposing? How do you start to move around that?
Ah, yes, right. So, first, I think, there's an old saying, we probably all have heard this, because it comes from a Christian tradition, Don't obsess about the speck in your neighbor's eye when there's a beam in your own. So it's one of the fundamental dysfunctions, I would say, of our everyday normal awareness is problems present themselves to us as out there. So this person acts in a certain way, or thinks in a certain way, or has a certain bias. And we forget who's making the observation. Right? There's an old saying, whenever the hand is in this position, just notice where 3 fingers are pointed. Right? So we tend to see the problem out there, and we just don't see what is it in us. So simple questions like, what is it about the person that bugs me? Okay, just so I build my awareness. When we were talking earlier, what triggers me? Sometimes there's very particular things a person does. It could be an expression they use. It could be a grimace or a way of a body gesture of some sort. Or it could be a tone of voice. They get what you would call dismissive. I'm just making it up, right? So the first step is usually getting a little more aware of what it is that's triggering me. What's going on inside me? That's a good start, but it's usually not enough in my experience, because it is about how we're interacting. So usually in my experience, at some point, we got to sit down and talk with the person and try to together create a little different context or environment or space that the conversation's a little different. One of the simplest things to do, here's a technique we often use for these problems. It's kind of I was going to say disingenuous. I don't think it's really disingenuous. I think it's just kind of a little circuitous. We have a situation like that, we'll say, well, you should do a dialogue. Let's say Fred really bugs Martha. We tell Martha, do a dialogue interview with Fred. What do you mean do a dialogue interview? Sit down with Fred and ask him to tell you a little bit about his life. A little bit about his life. How did I get where I am? What are some of the things that had an impact on me growing up? What are my folks like? Well, whatever. If you see, all I'm doing is trying to shift the nature of the conversation so a different space is evoked. What's very hard for us to see is the behavior that shows up between you and I, this two-person thing that's got this problematic dance going on, the space is a very active agent. We see the behavior. Again, usually a good step is to begin to reflect on our own inner state, what's triggering us. But what's very hard to see is the space. You take the same two people and you put them in a different space, maybe literally physically. You're having a walk outside, you're sitting down in a quiet place. It's different environment. But the space, I really mean particularly now, the nature of the context for the conversation. So that's why I say a clever little practice. Martha, go do a dialogue interview with Fred. And by the way, don't talk about work. Ask Fred if he's happy, if he's willing to talk with you a little bit about his life. Now, I'm describing this in a very structured way, right? But it could be as simple as sitting down with a person after dinner or after work and having a drink, having a cup of tea, doing something that's a little different that will naturally invite the two of you into a little different space. It could happen spontaneously. But there's always three parties in a conversation. Person A, person B, and the space that person A and B are creating. And our focus is usually on person B, the other. We don't get any place that way. We're just fighting. We have to start with putting a little more focus on person A, I, what's going on in me, but then paying a little attention to the space. It's so funny. I'm hopefully I'm on the right track here, but as you were talking, I was kind of imagining this as kind of one of these ritualized conflicts. What I mean by ritualized is two people have developed interlocking habits, where certain things in him trigger you, but probably certain things in you are triggering him, right? Accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you got to change the space in which the ritual is playing out, ultimately. And it's quite amazing. I never cease to be amazed. Two people who seem to be really stuck, all of a sudden find themselves in a different context, and they encounter each other in a kind of a fresh way, and all of a sudden, if there's openness, and that's why your first step is so important, if you're really open to it, it takes just the slightest little shift, and all of a sudden, the conversation's a little different. I had a friend who was doing a presentation once. This is a funny example, but I think it kind of illustrates the point. And he said, he was presenting to a group of business people, and he said it was just terrible. He said they were so stiff. They were so rigid. He couldn't do anything. He tried jokes. He tried stories that were personal. Nothing got, any real shift in the space that he was experiencing. And so he finally gave up, threw up his hands and said, turn to each other and tell each other a story about your mother. And he said it was amazing. In 10 minutes, the whole room changed. People were alive, they were excited, they were telling each other stories. It had nothing to do with the meeting, it had nothing to do with it, but he was desperate, and he just did something very clever in the moment that shifted the space. And all of a sudden, people could show up in a different way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm Jim Newman. I work for a company called Lenan Solutions. We do measurement and monitoring and things like that. A lot of facts. You were just talking about shifting the space, about changing an awareness or a quality of awareness. Also talked earlier about that role of sort of the loving relationship. You talked about awareness being the key. That couldn't be more relevant to the work here that we're engaged in about behavior in relationship to climate change mitigation and adaptation. This is key. This is something we struggle with. And in many ways, we do a lot of telling. We do a lot of providing fact.
Right.
And attempting to change behavior through persuasion.
Right.
What you're talking about is changing behavior through changing the tone, the quality of awareness. My experience is that one of the best ways to do that is to ask a question of some sort that you don't know the answer to.
Right.
You have just done this several times.
Yeah.
Work through it.
Yeah. Also, asking for help.
Asking for help. So maybe that's part of the answer. How can we do this at a scale that we're talking about?
Yeah.
scale of asking questions of hundreds or thousands of people that help change their awareness, which then can lead to a difference in behavior.
Well, there's so many levels of scale here, right? So, I mean, ultimately, we're talking about how human beings live on the planet Earth. So, at least at the context of this species and this particular planet, we're literally talking about the planet. So there's like goes on and on. So it's really important that we're aware of that. But climate change to me is an iconic problem in a couple of ways. One is it illustrates and it's just an example, it's just an illustration, it's not the problem of the world, but it illustrates, in my opinion, the problem of the world, which is human beings do not know how to live together on this planet right now. Period. You know, we do not know how to live together, and we do not know how to live with the other species which cohabitate this planet. If I used kind of traditional Asian language, also common many native peoples, we really just do not have an ethic of harmony. Right? We're very self-centered, we're very materialistic, we're, so much driven by make more money, buy more stuff. We already have a footprint that's probably 50% greater than the planet can tolerate. So this is a global problem. But I think there's two aspects to it. One is it illustrates this iconic problem that we will either figure out how to live in harmony as a global society with the living species on the planet Earth, or we will revert to living more locally. There'll be some sort of significant collapse. Not a lot of options here. Human beings can never live for long out of harmony with their natural and social environment. That's why you find the value of harmony so universal in long-lived cultures, like the Chinese, like most of the Eastern Asian cultures, and like most native cultures. They all have their own teachings about reverence for Mother Earth. The Confucian ethic is all about living in harmony with nature and with one another. And that's because it doesn't work any other way. It's like every species has to be in harmony with its niche, period. Biology 101, evolutionary biology 101. If it's not in harmony with its niche, the species doesn't continue. Okay. So climate change kind of illustrates this deeper problem. And it is just a set of symptoms, because we could get just as riled up about the destruction of species and the acidification of the oceans and several other facets of this global imbalance. But there's another part of it that I think is also iconic. I think, for me, I don't know, you guys may not agree with this, I think it's illustrative of fatalism. I think we live in an era of profound fatalism. I think people have a pretty darn good idea that climate change is a big issue, but they're also so convinced that nothing can be done, or nothing will be done, that they're actually very fatalistic. I've come to this conviction in part from a lot of work with kids. If you get young people into a conversation about the future, I will guarantee you, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, pretty soon you'll start to encounter this fatalism. Must have been over 10 years ago, I was in a conversation with a group of educators and two 12-year-olds. It was a small group, it was only about 15 people. And one of the guys turned to one of the two 12-year-olds, and said, "What do you think about the future?" And without a moment's notice, this 12-year-old girl said, "Well, we sort of figure you drank your juice and then you drank ours." That's exactly what she said. We sort of figure you drank your juice and then you drank ours. So this fatalism is very deep. And the reason I bring it up is the way you we're kind of framing the question. Yeah, climate change is a global issue. We do know that. Ultimately, it's about human beings living differently on the planet. But interimly, it's about what are some of our next steps and how to honor even the smallest step and how to use small steps to build a sense of efficacy. As far as I'm concerned, the very first fundamental problem here is we have to get beyond the fatalism. The problem is tough enough without adding in the psychology of fatalism. The problem is simply a tough problem. We know that. You guys all know that. This is going to take decades. Realistically, when you consider the CO2 that, for all intents and purposes, is already in the atmosphere, we're talking generations. I don't think that's impossible. I think human beings have done a lot of things that took generations, but not from a sense of fatalism. They have to have a sense of aspiration, and they have to have, here's what we're working on now. Oh, by the way, here's what we're going to try to accomplish in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. So, we do a lot of preaching. We preach about global issues. My experience is after about 5 minutes, it's counterproductive. Our oldest son has grown up with these issues. It means I've been around these issues my whole life. I was part of the group at MIT that wrote a little book called The Limits to Growth, 40 years ago, that talked about why you couldn't continue global economic development and global population growth in a finite planet. Okay? So I'm really interested to watch his attitude. He's now in his early 30s. He doesn't want to hear at all about the problems. He knows about the problems. All he wants to talk about is what are people doing today. He's now writing articles, blogs and other articles on social entrepreneurs. He loves doing this because he can talk about somebody doing something very concrete in a real setting that helps real people. And I think his kind of state of mind is a good illustration that preaching is only useful for a very short period of time. In some cases, might not be useful for any period of time because people kind of get it. But how we build momentum, how we recognize what is being accomplished, how we help people see, well, what can I do? What's a small step? Hey, they're really small steps. By definition, they're really, really small steps. Minute steps. How do we celebrate the minute steps and not keep ourselves in a mindset that says, that step's too small. That's never going to solve climate change. There's so much more that needs to be done. The world does not need our negativism. The problems are big enough by themselves. If we can't muster a sense of enthusiasm for every small step and honoring every gesture, no matter how small, if it's coming from the right place, then we really are doomed. Because that's really clear to me. That's going to be the first important development for all of us who are engaged. How do we allow our state of mind to be stable and always focused on what needs to happen and what is positive about what's happening? You all know, well, I shouldn't say this. Because of the kind of Buddhist background for a lot of the work of Garrison, probably many of you are aware that in that tradition, as in many traditions, one of the cornerstones of the tradition, beside your meditation and your mindfulness practice, is your vows. But there's really not a very good understanding of what it means. A lot of people think, oh, well, it's my commitment to the liberation of all human beings. Okay, that's great. That's very abstract. Here's what it really means. It means your commitment to be vigilant on your mental and emotional state. Because to be committed to the liberation of all sentient beings is terrific. Sounds great on paper. It's how I show up in this moment, and in this moment, and in this moment. Can I stabilize my emotional and mental state? So for those of us working on things like climate change, man, this is, in my opinion, this is the nuts and bolts of it. Because we cannot afford the negativism. We must be good at celebrating each step. And always noticing, because we're fallible. We're human beings. We're going to have negative. We're going to have fear. We're going to have negative thoughts. We're going to go, oh God, it's so small, and we've got so far. But that's natural. What I mean by vigilant is I now notice that, and I let it go, and I come back to the enthusiasm for the moment here and now. It's the only way. So I hope that's relevant. But I thought the way you framed it, you kind of invited us to think about how do we kind of keep that vigilance of honoring each step. Now the other part of it, of course, we got to keep thinking about the next steps. So we can't be complacent because by golly, it is going to take generations. And we needed to start 30 or 40 years ago. We know that, okay? But we are where we are. And how do we kind of take the next step? Think about the step after that. Help people see that for themselves. As I say, my work with kids has convinced me that without doubt, the number one most important thing is helping each child feel a sense of efficacy and hope. We have not done a very good job of that.
My name is Jeremy Sharp. I am a master developer in Arizona. We are developing a 3,000-acre master plan, so about 30,000 residents. And we're implementing a lot of different sustainable techniques and attributes into our community. But as with the West Coast and certain areas in the South, or all throughout the United States, maybe the consumers aren't quite buying into it and engaging on that level. So how do you move people from a community aspect? We have 15,000 residents. How do we move our community to pass our fatalism or pass our own beliefs towards sustainability or kindness or whatever, more empathy and compassion in those ways, more awareness in that shift?
So, same thing I was talking about a few minutes ago, but a little context, a little different here. So first off, you use the word community. How do we move the community? That's a big category. Who's already moved? Who within that community is already exhibiting the compassion, the empathy, the concern that you would like to see on a larger scale? I'm sure there are folks. How do you make their journey more visible to others? How do you support them? Here's the first, well, I guess I said the first one a while ago. I would call this now the second basic strategy here in change efforts. The first one is we focus on what's wrong and we fix a bunch of problems. The second one, though, is we fail to work with the people who are already on board and ask them, what will help you? How can I be supportive in expanding your efforts? What do you see as a next step? So go where the energy is already there. And really ask those folks, well, this is pretty cool. Don't you want to do more? The timer in this room, just turn the lights off. I'm going to turn it back on. Okay, remember I said the energy efficient building? Well, this is the energy efficient building. Yeah, okay. See, the timer just saw me walking, so it knows there's somebody in this room now. It's a cool building, it really is. You get the feeling of kind of like being in this intelligence, which is probably not unrelated to why we're here, right? You guys have this enormous leverage of helping to shape the built environment. So this little vignette we just played out. For me, when that happened, I could really feel the intention of the designers and the people who worked so long, really several years, to plan out this building. And so it would turn the lights off automatically until it sensed somebody moving in this room, and then it turned them back on. And so for me, that's a gesture, for me internally, of honoring that intention. And that's the kind of energy that will grow this. Honor the people who are committed. Work with them, support them. So let me now say it in the negative, because for me often this is the way I can always remember it. If I ever find myself investing any of my energy to try to convince anybody of anything, I try to stop. I'm never happy doing it. They're usually not very happy on the receiving end. And my experience in general is it's pretty low leverage. Go where the energy is moving. You can accelerate it, shape it, influence it. You don't have to create it. It's there.
Hi, Peter. My name is David McCarthy. I'm with Jonathan Rose Companies. And during your talk, I was thinking about what structure exists in my life that helps build awareness. And for me personally, it's organized religion. And I was thinking a little bit about why.
Mm-hmm.
And one aspect of religion that I think works for me is attending once a week and kind of regularly repeating the message that makes me step back and think about what I'm doing. And I was wondering if you have found in your research that that strategy is effective for many organizations, or if that's just a personal thing of mine.
Well, there's a couple different facets to the way you're illustrating this. So the regularity, the attending once a week, I think absolutely. You know, in some sense, you can put it in kind of classic learning terminology. Practice, 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 right? If we don't have a regularity in what we're practicing, we don't develop new capabilities. It's the way human beings learn anything. And it's just as true of something subtle, like how we give awareness to the transcendent aspects of our experience. I'll just use that language if it's okay. We practice. And we make a commitment. When I was about your age, I was working with a wonderful colleague who was about 5-7 years older than me, and very accomplished, really accomplished composer, just amazing guy. And he had made an interesting comment to me. He said, "Peter, you're really talented, but you're not very disciplined." And he said, "You're kind of getting by on your talent." And it really struck me, because it was said with such a directness and with such an open heart. He wasn't trying to change me. He was just making an observation. And that really helped me to see the importance of becoming more disciplined, a little more serious about my own development. I think that's absolutely right. I think it's also true of organizations. With the group of Chinese who we're starting to work with for this next 2 months, this next 6 months, we took them to an organization to visit in the New York area, which is a very kind of enlightened, but in their world, they're in financial services. So this is a very interesting trading company. And they got to see that one of the things they do every single day in that company, they have huddles. So people come together, 20 minutes, and they immediately talk about, here's my concerns right now, and they sift through these and discern concerns into issues. And once there's enough consensus on an issue, they all start working on, well, how do we understand the deeper causes of this issue? And it's a discipline. It's part of the way they work together. And it causes them to regularly reflect and be in conversation with one another about things that really matter to them. So it's maybe kind of a mundane example, but I think the principles here are really simple. If we're serious, we got to be serious. And if we're not disciplined, we're not serious. This is always about the development of who we are as human beings. Always. It's the lifelong journey of becoming a human being. And it requires a certain degree of serious commitment. Can I just make one more comment, because I don't know how much this was part of why you asked. When you started off and you were talking about one of the things that provides structure in my life for building my awareness is my religion and the regularity of that. I kind of took it in the direction of discipline and commitment to practice. But you might have also been wanting to point out something about religion itself.
I think what I was pointing out the regularity in that religion never lets you stray too far from the ideals in a way.
Right.
Because you're constantly reminded of once per week how you have strayed from the ideal, and and I think that's a good thing, and I guess
right.
Maybe that's what you're asking.
Okay. Well, so let me just add one more additional comment, which is now to me very clear from what you just said, which is that religion in the way you're talking about now is practiced in some community. Right? Because you show up once a week, and in the context of that community and its heritage, its lineage, its teachings, its convictions, you're reminded. So there is something very important about how we do this together. I think that is really important. And, you know, you all are different types of organizations, and organizations are all very different, but the way in which we can create the possibility for people in all kinds of different settings where they are together, working together, to create an element of sacredness in their work is, I think, always present. Obviously, we have many religious traditions, and that's very important for all of us. The variety of religious traditions is part of the variety of nature, right? Nature produces variety. Human beings mimic nature, and we produce variety. So this is more about the deeper essence and how we collectively acknowledge and create spaces of acknowledging the sacred. It's very important. And I use that term because I think it's a term that's really beyond any particular set of religious convictions or beliefs or practices. To me, the sacred is when we connect with life in its purest form, which is both physical and non-physical. And we're in the presence of that. We experience things like awe, reverence. I'm both very small and very expanded, that kind of paradoxical state where I realize I'm just a little tiny, but I'm also something much bigger. And so that's what I mean by the sacred. And I think that's what it means to be human. To thoughtfully find ways to create experiences of the sacred together.
Hi. I'm Bomi Jung. I'm from Enterprise, which is an affordable housing organization. And I was thinking back on the story you were telling us about the cartridge folks at HP, and wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how they manage transitions amongst the folks who are involved in that group. So I'm imagining that when they're sitting down to interview with, an entry-level industrial designer or whatever, they're probably not asking them, like, how do you feel about our loving relationships?
Not exactly.
Interview. So how do they do that?
But not far off. They would certainly ask the person to share a little bit of their experience of working. And they would really be interested if the person had some experience of the importance of working effectively with others. Some experience of collaboration that was meaningful to them. And they probably would also ask, and why was it meaningful to you? So, terminology, words can always put people off. So we always have to find infinite variety of ways to talk about the things that matter. So we can be meeting people where they are, not distancing ourselves from them by the use of some jargon or some particular terminology. We do that all the time, and we often do it rather thoughtlessly. But they were so clear in their intent. And that's why I told you the story about our loving relations. They didn't talk about that with hardly anybody, but it really helped them understand the essence of what they cared about, which was, that's why I gave you that definition, these acts of allowing another to be a legitimate other. That had profound meaning for them. And because they understood it at such an essential, fundamental level, they could talk about it in a million ways. So it would be as simple as, hey, in your past work, have you had collaborations? Have you worked with others that you really enjoyed? Cool. What did you enjoy about it? What was useful? What was meaningful for you? So it could be a very simple way of doing, but they would certainly ask that. How we bring people into organizations is very important, just as how we help them out. These kind of transitions of people are really important. And how we bring them in a way that they have some feeling of what matters to us, but not with us imposing it on them. How we look for the commonality, the connection we have already with this is what matters to us, and oh yes, it's what matters to me. So that's kind of on the entry side. But of course on the exit side, you have the very similar set of issues, often neglected. You know, I find that the amount of attention given to getting the right people in is often 10 times as great to the attention given to how to get the wrong people out. Because, you know, it's like birth and death. Guess what? They both are equally important. How we attend to the birthing and how we attend to the transitioning beyond. These are equally important. Every culture that, in my opinion, has some sanity attends to both with equal attention. So these transitions are really important. And the same is true of organizations. I have a friend who was a master manager. He was at Ford for most of his career. Just an amazing guy. People loved working with Roger. He was so good at growing people and producing and helping them produce really remarkable business results. But he was given a talk at MIT once. And he happened to make the comment about, well, he had to actually fire some people in this job. He was telling a story, and you know, somebody wasn't right, and he had to help them out. The MIT students, the management students, literally invited him back to give a lunchtime talk, which is all completely voluntary. 200 students showed up for him to share his experience of what it was like to fire people compassionately. It was beautiful. And it was just, again, attending to the transitions. They're really important. The gist of it was really simple. How to do it with profound respect. How to help a person understand the best you can, because, you know, this is always going to be difficult because you're dealing with somebody who's in a state of anxiety, fear, anger, rejection. We know these are not simple emotions. But just to be very clear, you know, here's why this is a thing that's timely. You'll be completely on the level. That's very hard. No one ever likes doing it, but it's the first gesture of respect. And then typically what Roger illustrated was how he worked with them to help them move on in their life. Because basically this is just about fit. You know, we no longer fit here. By the way, that's particularly crucial for senior people. People in senior positions of influence who are no longer in harmony with the way the organization is trying to work. I cannot tell you how many organizations I've seen in my life that are crippled because you've got one or two people in key positions who really should have been helped out the door. But nobody will do it. No one has the courage or the respect for that person. Because if the fit isn't quite right, everybody knows it. And if it's done well, it's part of the natural process of review. You know, so you don't want to start off by trying to fire somebody. You want to start off by helping someone understand why they're kind of not quite in sync now. And what specifically are the things they need to work on. And then you kind of work with them closely to see if they really are serious about doing that. And then, you know, get to a certain point, if they're not or they can't, it's not the right time in their life, then how to help them move on. So transitions. It's really so much of where the rubber meets the road in good management. Helping the people in, helping people out.
My name is Z. Smith. I'm an architect in New Orleans with SQ Dumas Ripple. I'm a recovering physicist, though, as having studied at MIT many years back. One of the things that struck me, especially from the earlier thread, and now it's coming full circle, in how you laid out the notion of change, was that we bring, especially those of us dealing with buildings, bring a sort of Newtonian mechanistic view of how buildings work, and then we wonder why they don't work as we had expected. Part of my transition through was meeting a woman who's, my wife is an ecologist, and it developed a much greater appreciation for that what drives change in systems is not intention, all the giraffes stretching their necks, but rather the diversity to which you alluded, where there is some, and that what drives the transition of giraffes getting taller is that finding that variation from the mean that your model.
Right.
variation and a respect for that diversity and that variation that actually drives the growth of the species over time towards a better fit to future conditions. And I think that one thing that I've been trying to develop a greater sense of, that some of you're talking about how organizations change, is that they don't all change by all stretching their necks. It's finding that, said you sort of counseled one of the questionnaires to go find that little section that's a little different and grow that and follow that growth. And so I thinking less like Newton and more like Darwin is sort of a helpful way to start thinking of the built environment as a living system.
It's quite a challenge, because as someone with scientific training, even in physics, Western science is still, I would say, in the early stages of growing out of its mechanistic heritage. Scientists, always like to talk about mechanisms. What's the mechanism behind this? And that kind of gives it away. Darwin wrote a very poignant letter. You can probably just Google Darwin's letter to his friend, because I think it's kind of accessible these days. I saw it first about 10 years ago. It's very poignant. It was written near the end of his life, and he's writing to a very close friend, and it's basically a lament. He talks about the things he lost over the course of his life. He starts it off by saying, "When I was young, I never let a day go by without reading some stanzas from Shelley or Keats or Byron." He said, "It's probably been 20 years since I have read a line of poetry, and today I cannot bear to listen to it." He then literally says, "My mind has become a kind of machine," that's his words, "for grinding out generalizable laws from particular facts." So the culture of science drifted so far towards that mechanistic side. Remember Newton's famous line. He said, "My job is to understand God's clockwork." That was literally the metaphor that the 17th century scientists were oriented by. That the universe was a giant clockwork, a giant machine, and we had to try to figure it out. So now in this last century, we're starting to see some chinks in that armor, right? It's starting to break down. And we realize that it's not as predictive, and it's not as deterministic, and it's certainly not as mechanistic as we originally thought. But the cultures behind even those discoveries is deep. And that's why I think it's important for us to remember this, working in the kind of work all of us do. I said before, about climate change. This is going to take generations, not even decades. The way a culture sheds a certain layer of enculturation and gradually grows into another is a multiple generational phenomenon. We are mechanists deep at heart. We're so conditioned by that. And I'm sure your conversation with your wife, you've been kind of discovering different aspects of this. And it just, we have to just be compassionate for ourselves. This is a long journey. We've taken, many hundreds of years to dig ourselves in the hole we're in. Yes, the hole has symptoms like climate change, like the destruction of species, like, the acidification of the oceans. Those are symptoms. But the cultural roots are the fact that we've allowed ourselves to drift far, far away from being in harmony with the living universe. And that drift will take a long time to come back. Every positive step I've ever seen moving back is people connect with that. They can let go of a little bit of control. Control is a very mechanistic concept, right? You control a car because that makes a good car. You want it to do what you want it to do. But living systems control themselves. They can be influenced, but they can't be controlled. Humberto calls that autonomy. It's one of his 3 definitions of a living system. It's autonomous. That's why convincing people is such a bad idea, because you go right against their natural instinct, innate, to be autonomous. Someone comes up to you and says, "Be happy." Your first reaction is, "Who are you to tell me to be happy?" Right? And of course, what would you want more than to be happy? And yet there's another part of you that's autonomous. So all these things are a process of rediscovery. But it's not like we don't have it in us. That, of course, is crucial. All of this is in us. It's who we are. It's just a long arc where we're going back to becoming who we are in a new context. We've never had to do this with 7 or 8 or 9 billion people on the planet. Hopefully we will find a way. But that is the option right now. It's a different context, but it's who we are.
I'm Jeff Perlman. I'm the president and founder of Bright Power, and we've grown to 50 people in 9 years. And so, some of the early questions I think around leadership is something that I'm sort of left wondering, what's the most important, where the role of leadership is in really setting those unreasonable goals and inspiring. Because I mean, so much what you're talking about is kind of, I don't want to say going with the flow, but kind of like finding the energy and sort of.
Right.
When we get leaders who, can sort of make the unreasonable make it happen. So how does that factor into?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and it's a great question because I think it could correct a way of hearing some of what I've said, which I wouldn't agree with, because I agree very much with what you just said, but I think it's subtle. I think you're absolutely right. There are moments when an individual or 2 or 3 people say, we could do this, and it seems impossible. And yet, over time, it turns out to be absolutely catalytic. The danger in it is very simple. The danger is ego. When the impulse, when the energy, the source of that statement is something that's coming from me as an isolated, separate entity, it's very dangerous. When the source of it is coming from a larger awareness, and you'll know this. I mean, you sat down, so I can't quite see you, but I'm assuming you know exactly what I mean. When the source is coming from a larger awareness, there'll be profound humility. You'll know that this is like a crazy thing, but it feels like the right thing now. You'll test the waters. You'll talk with others. You won't be rigid. Yeah, that first stake might be catalytic, but eventually what really needs to happen might be literally over here, not here. But putting that stake in the ground starts the energy moving. But to put a stake in the ground from a state of mind and awareness of real service and real humility, and all I really care ultimately about is how I serve what's trying to emerge, is profoundly different than coming from ego and trying to prove that I can do it. And we might say, well, I got to prove that we can do it. But we really mean, I want to prove that I can do it. It will always backfire. So on the surface, it may look the same, and I agree with you completely. There are times, I mean, our artistic people know this quite well. I think there's a principle here which is really articulated very well in a lot of artistic traditions. Robert Frost once said, all great things are created for their own sake. All great things are created for their own sake. He didn't say for the artist's sake. And if you've ever read the Hesse novel, which we've used for years around leadership, which is beautiful. My favorite book on leadership still for a gazillion years is Servant Leadership. It's written by Robert Greenleaf, and his basic idea is the essence of being a great leader is to be a servant. You're serving those who lead, you're serving what wants to emerge. You're serving a larger purpose. Greenleaf builds the entire novel, the entire book, Servant Leadership, around the Hesse novel, the Hermann Hesse novel, A Journey to the East. Because A Journey to the East is a story of a German man who's seeking enlightenment and travels all around the East, goes through all kinds of travails, almost dies, tremendous emotional and psychological travails. Finally, he locates the order he's looking for. Throughout the journey, he's sustained by his servant, Leo. And he discovers when he finally finds the order that the head of the order is none other than Leo. So that's Hess's story. And Robert Greenleaf, who wrote the book Servant Leadership, takes it as this iconic, beautiful, archetypal story about the servant as the leader. In the end of the story, the very last scene, they're sitting at a fire, and he's holding an image of that was given to him, which has kind of become an icon of his own identity. And he's sitting, the protagonist of the story, and he watches the image dissolve. And he realizes that everything he ultimately learned from Leo was about the dissolution of his autonomous, separate identity. So there's paradox inside a paradox. Yes, it's a bold statement. You got to stick your neck out. I agree with you completely. And it may be just you initially, but if where you're coming from is beyond just your ego needs, it will make a profound difference. It will work. You will be serving a larger purpose. I say you'll be open. It'll evolve. You won't have to kill yourself trying to convince everybody else that they're wrong and you're right. You'll be able to listen. And gradually, I don't know any other way to say it. This is a little bit maybe esoteric, but it's my experience. Your energy will help to make it happen. Thank you. It's a wonderful question.